second.
Okay, I wanted to just get a cue. Okay, great. Let me just get actually set up better.
Okay, I'm ready.
Great, let me just open this up to full screen. Great, okay. Good evening, everyone. Are we good, Juliana?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm just going to send the source sheet and we're good.
Okay, great. Perfect. The source sheet will be posted in 1 second. Hold on, I'm just gonna get going here. Okay, good evening, everybody. I hope that this finds all of you safe and well. I'm going to begin tonight with an announcement that is sad for me, which is that for an array of reasons, tonight's session will be the last session of this series, at least for a while. This series is going to come to an end. We may resume again in a month or two. There's lots and lots of stuff on jewishlive.org and lots of stuff through Hadar basically every day. And I hope those of you who are not familiar with Hadar's offerings, that you'll go to our website and familiarize yourself with them. I really just want to express my gratitude to all of you. This has been a really wonderful experience for me, and I hope for many of you as well. We are going to explore Psalm 104 this evening, which is, in traditional Jewish context, the Psalm for Rosh Chodesh, Barchi Nafshi. And as I mentioned last week, we're going to do something a little different this week than we've done in all of the many previous sessions of this, which is that we are not going to begin by reading the whole psalm together. And that is simply because it is so long and we have a short time. So what instead I'm going to do is kind of say a few sentences or paragraphs by way of introduction to how we might think about this psalm, and then we're going to try to walk through it together. So this psalm, Psalm 104, Mizmor Kuf Daled, is, you could say, a kind of exultant celebration of God's dominion over the whole vast world of creation. It is praise of the creator of a perfect world. And you see what I mean by calling it a perfect world as we go. One of the things that marks this world that the psalm imagines as perfect is that it exists in perfect ecological harmony, in which every last creature is provided for, and in which evil and the thwarting of God's plans does not take place. And that will help us also understand the very last part of the psalm, which often strikes people as surprising. From a kind of theological and spiritual perspective, I think that what you find in this text is a kind of pervasive sense that the entire world is God's gift, and that it is a gift to all of God's creatures. It is very important for understanding this psalm. The world is not a gift for humanity. The world is a gift for everything God has made. Now, part of what comes entwined with the idea that the world is a gift is a pervasive sense that all of creation shares a kind of elemental and inescapable dependence on God. And the psalm also maintains, I think, a very deep and a sense of God's immediate and constant involvement with God's creatures. And in that sense, I think it's probably fair to say still am thinking about whether this is right, but I think it's right, that there's a stark contrast that we'll see in this text between this text and Genesis 1. Genesis 1 kind of imagines a picture in which a lot of God's work is complete when that story comes to an end. I think that that's true about Genesis 1, hence the whole notion of divine rest, etc. Whereas in this psalm, I think what you have is somewhat different. You have a sense that God is kind of actively, providentially involved in every detail of the governing of the world. And here again, I'll just add something I have said countless times before over the course of this series. That, of course, raises the question for many people about whether and how they can find themselves saying the I voice, embracing the voice of the psalmist in their own liturgical life, if we don't always find ourselves, fully signing up for the whole theological picture that the psalmist assumes. I think that one thing that is really kind of integral to this psalm, critical to it, and it's impossible to understand it otherwise, I think it's impossible to understand the psalm accurately, let alone well, is that although human beings do get a little more attention than other living things, right? There is a certain limited exceptionality to humans. There is no trace here of human beings being supreme over the creatures in general, right? We are fellow creatures. God provides for the human, but the psalmist is very emphatic. God provides for others too, and God provides for the human in the context of providing for everyone. To invoke language I've used in a couple of other instances, the psalm is radically theocentric rather than anthropocentric, right? Radically focused on God rather than on the human. I think that we might also say, and then perhaps we should go into the text. I want to mention that there's a German Bible scholar named Gerstenberger who observes that Genesis 1, as we talked about a couple sessions ago, has what is often referred to by scholars and by devout Christians as a dominion model of creation, right? That is, the human beings are appointed to rule over the rest of the world, the meaning of Tselem Elohim that we talked about at some length. But this psalm has what Gerstenberger calls an integration model. That is, the human being is fully integrated within all of creation and is not necessarily elevated above it. And Gerstenberger and those who follow him talk about how the integration model kind of runs alongside the dominion model from the start of the Bible, but really reaches its peak in many ways in this psalm and in some of the chapters of Job, where Job too is reminded, you're just part of a much bigger thing that's not about you. Okay, and with that, let's dive into the text itself. Some scholars, I guess I'll say this. I guess I'll say this here, because it might be helpful to keep this in the back of your mind as we go. Some scholars place verses 1 to 9 under the rubric of creation, and verses 10 to 23 under the rubric of providence, and then 24 to 30 bring them both into view, creation and providence. You could do with that as you will. You'll see what you think. In the opening verses, we learn that God is somehow clothed in the glory of God's creation. God dwells in God's creation and is in fact carried and transported by it, whatever we think that might mean, which I confess at this point, I'm not sure. So, okay, verse 1. Barchi nafshi et Adonai, JPS here, bless the Lord, O my soul. Again, as we've talked about on a few occasions, maybe nefesh means soul here. JPS, NIV, NRSV all suggest that. Robert Alter, expressing the common skepticism of Bible scholars about nefesh meaning soul, talks about bless the Lord, O my being. which that would be my default translation. Adonai Elohai gadalta me'od, Lord my God, you are very, very great. Hod v'hadar lavashta, you are clothed in glory and majesty. Hod v'hadar are the trappings of kingship, right? So the elements of the natural world serve as the trappings of God's royal status. Robert Alter, who, as I've mentioned in several of these sessions, where Alter shines is in the literary. So he translates Hod v'hadar as grandeur and glory, because he's trying to capture here the assonance of Hod v'hadar. Okay, verse 2, right? Ote or kasalma, wrapped in a robe of light. Note shamayim kayiriya, you spread the heavens like a tent cloth. Spreading the heavens like a cloth is something we see not infrequently in Tanakh, and we also find that transported into our Aleinu prayer, Shehu Noteh Shamayim, right? V'yoseid Aretz, you spread the heavens out like a tent cloth. Now here, I just want to observe, and this is an example of what I mean when I say, as I often have, that the meaning of biblical texts often takes place between them rather than simply within them. By far, the majority of uses of the word Yiri'ah in Tanakh refer to the curtain of the Mishkan. See, for example, Exodus 26. And if it is the case that when the psalmist says Yiri'ah, the biblical reader or davener is expected to sort of hear, oh, Yiri'ah, temple, this suggests that God's real house ultimately is not the temple, but the universe, which is what is appropriate for a cosmic ruler. Or if you prefer, the universe itself is a temple for God. And in another year, in another series, we could explore the ways, I have a chapter on this in the Heart of Torah for those who are interested, the ways in which in biblical theology, it's very clear that the world, the cosmos, and the temple are mirrors of each other. They are homologous, I think is the word you would use here. And so there's a way in which saying that God stretches the sky like a Yiri'ah may be yet another way in which the world is imagined as a temple. And of course, I think from a devotional perspective, it's worth stopping to ask, what claim is being made on us by the idea that the entirety of the world is supposed to be thought of, perceived, and experienced as a temple rather than just a particular place? If you prefer, you could say, anytime you create a sacred space, you are in some ways secularizing, paradoxically, right? Because when you create a space and call it sacred, you are implying that other places are less sacred. Whereas if you have a vision of the entire world as sacred, right, that's a deeply holy vision. I hope that that's clear. Can someone nod if we followed what I just said? Okay. I got 2 nods that I can see on my screen, so that's good. I'll take it. Okay. Verse 3, we hear about God setting the rafters of his lofts in the waters above the rakia of the heavens, right? God has waters. Remember the creation story? There's the rakia that pushes the upstairs water, if you will. And apparently God builds his lofts or upper chambers in those waters. At least I think that's what this means. Hamehalech al kanfei hasam avim rechuvo hamhalech al kanfei ruach. God makes the clouds God's chariot. God moves on the wings of the winds. The notion of God moving on the clouds, rochev baravot, we find also in Psalms 18 and 68. Okay. Verse 4, Ose malachav ruchot mishartav eish lo hate. God makes the winds his messengers. This is a little bit like what we saw in Psalm 148 2 sessions ago. And then we get to our first kind of like controversy about how to interpret this text. We hear that God established the earth on its foundation so that it shall never totter. That is, it will not surrender to the forces of chaos. And then we hear about Tehom kilvush kisito al harim yam dumayim. You made the deep cover it as a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. Min ga'arat chayinu soon. They fled at your blast. Min kol ram chayi chafezun. They rushed away at the sound of your thunder. Ya'alu harim yerdu v'kaot. Mountains rising, valleys sinking to the place you established for them.
The only thing that sort of put a...
Can we, whoever's unmuted, can you mute yourself, please?
While we have a lot of candidates before high holidays, and that we use high holidays as an opportunity to roll this out.
Okay, can whoever's talking mute?
About that possibility. Unfortunate reality is...
Great, thank you. And then, Gvul Samta Bal Yavorun, you set bounds they may not pass. Bal Yeshuvun L'chasotars, they never again cover the earth. What is this unit about? So there is what I will call the moderate reading and the radical reading, which, I mean, there's no judgment in my use of those terms. I could probably come up with better words. I'm tempted to say the Parav reading and the Fleshik reading, but you'll see what I mean in a minute. The moderate reading is essentially that God creates the primordial waters and then separated them from dry land, and God's blast puts those waters to flight, and the waters will never cover the earth. You find that moderate reading, for example, in the Jewish Study Bible, and in even more domesticated in Robert Alter's commentary. Robert Alter has, in general, a very difficult time with the ways that the Bible still has live mythological imagery. You find this almost reactive, this like reflex in Alter every time to say, oh, this is just kind of like language that's left over in a now thoroughly monotheistic context. What I said before about how Alter's strength is in his observations about literature, his weakness is in pretty consistently in his observations of religion and theology. Those of you who are interested in biblical studies, Alter's biblical theology is basically still Yechezkel Kaufman, whereas that's just simply not where biblical studies is and not where it's been for, I would say, almost 2 generations now. So what the radical reading that's going on here is that these verses depict God, Yud-He Vav-He, as a kind of storm god who defeats the sea and through that creates the cosmos, right? Verses 6 to 9, basically tell us how the waters covered even the tops of the mountains, and then God rebuked them, verse 7, and that is through thunder, and that threw them into a panic, and like soldiers of an enemy troop that basically panic and run away, the waters retreat. They go up mountains and down valleys until they arrive at the shore, which becomes their new boundary. And that is the creation of the world. This highly mythological image of defeating and subduing the waters, defeating and subduing chaos. I will maybe just say this, and this is a text that I feel like one could spend the rest of one's life trying to understand. And I hope this doesn't sound completely off the wall. The moderate reading is bolstered by the opening of verse 6, which makes it seem like God laid out the waters in the first place. The radical reading is supported by everything else, which makes it seem like God is defeating these kind of chaotic forces and kind of pushing them down to the ground, subduing them, so that God's world cannot totter any longer. Okay, I hope that is at least somewhat clear. Okay, now when we get to verse 10, we now see this ordered, habitable world emerges, and God is seen, as I said at the outset, as providing for the creatures God has created in an ongoing way. God not only creates them, but also sustains them. And if you look at verses 10 and 11, I think you'll see something really beautiful here. God makes springs gush forth in torrents, right? And what do? Yashku kol chayto sadai. They give drink to all of the beasts of the field, right? And they slake the thirst of donkeys. Notice what has happened here. Instead of waters of chaos, or maybe even out of waters of chaos, God made springs that sort of like, wend their way through the mountains and the hills so the animals can drink. It's almost like, how water is a symbol for many of us of sustenance and threat. Water is a good example of something that is a symbol of one thing and its opposite. Water is the drink that a parched person takes, but it's also a tsunami. It's almost like the progression from verses 6 through 9 to verses 10 to 11 are like God took the tsunami and made it a glass of ice cold water, right? That's the kind of theological shift that the psalm is, and the poetic shift that the psalm is imagining here. Now, the water is kind of like a fountain of life, and the animals and the birds are refreshed by it. Water becomes no longer a threat, but a source of sustenance. It's probably worth saying that in verse 11, I think it might be important that the text emphasizes that God also sustains the praim, the wild animals. It's not just that God sustains the animals that the little kids like to visit at the Bronx Zoo. It's everything, tame, untame, etc. Okay? Now, verse 12, we have an interesting kind of little textual or translational problem. Alehem ofa shamayim yishkon, right? Mibein afaim yitnu kol. So the birds of the sky dwell, JPS says, beside them and sing among the foliage. Alehem, so JPS says beside them. Robert Alter translates, interestingly, above them, which might be, if you know modern Hebrew, what you imagine alehem to mean, which I think means that Alter thinks that them, alehem, refers to the beasts, that the birds dwell up above the beasts, whereas JPS, which translates beside them, I think takes the them to refer to the springs. Now, some of you might say, I cannot imagine a less interesting conversation in my life, but I do want to try to understand what alehem actually means here. And I'm not sure which one of those is exactly right. For the Hebrew lovers among you, I should just mention that at least some ancient versions read yitnu kolam. The birds will express that, will put out their voice. Not sure. Okay. Now, verses 13 to 15, you have this kind of transition, I think. The mention of the sky then yields to mention of the rain, which waters the vegetation and enables the thriving and the production of agricultural products. Okay, or if you prefer, you could imagine that there's water coming from below; those are the springs, and there's water coming from above; those are that is the rain. And then what you would have here, and I don't know if this is conscious, is an interesting kind of softening and domestication of the image of the flood in Noah, where the water explodes from top and bottom. Here, the water comes nurturing from top and bottom. Okay? And then we hear this beautiful image. Mi prima asecha, I'm in verse 13 at the end. Tisba haaretz. The earth is sated. Images that you might tend to assume relate to the human, but here the interest is in all of creation being sated. And with that in mind, if you let your eyes just scroll down a little to verse 16, you'll see that we then hear Yisba'u atzei Hashem. The trees are sated and satisfied. It may be worth saying that you could argue that this scene is profoundly about joy, right? There is singing in verse 12, second part of verse 12. There is delight over food and wine that we're about to get to in verse 15, as well as an appreciation of the beauty of the world. This is a scene of profound joy. We have moved very far, very fast from forces of chaos threatening to undermine God's plans for the world and render it uninhabitable. In fact, you have here a scene of great joy and delight. And as we'll see in a few moments, what I alluded to at the beginning, ecological harmony. Okay, now, so if we go to verse 14, we see here, Matzmiach chatzir for the behemah, God makes the grass grow for the cattle, ve'esev la'avodat ha'adam, and JPS translates herbage for man's labor. NIV says herbage for man to cultivate. NRSV, I think more unlikely, for people to use. I just don't think that's what avodat adam means. Now, some people who I think are affected by other biblical texts want to hear in this verse the idea that animals and plants are for human use. I just don't really see that here. This seems actually quite mistaken. And I'll say a little bit more as we go about why. Okay, and we get to verse 15, we hear, V'yayin yisamach levav enosh, wine cheers the hearts of people, lehatzhil panim mishemen. JPS translates oil that makes the face shine. So first, it's worth saying here, I'm sorry, let me finish the rest of it. V'lechem levav enosh isad, and bread sustains a person's life. So it's worth saying here that you have the three main crops of the agricultural year in Palestine. You have grain for bread, that's May to June, grapes for wine, that's August, September, and olives for oil, that's October. Wine is associated with luxury, with pleasure, oil with luxury. The elemental, all of the basic produce of the earth, all made possible here by God's bringing water to the land. Now, this phrase, V'yayin yisamach levav enosh lehatzhil panim mishamen, is, I just want to point out again for the Hebrew infatuated, is actually a difficult phrase to translate. JPS, as I said, wine that cheers the hearts of men, oil that makes the face shine. That's also more or less what NIV and NRSV have. Robert Alter, I think he's wrong, but Robert Alter here reads, for the second half, and wine that cheers the hearts of men to make the face shine from, I'm sorry. And wine that gladdens the heart of man to make the faces shine brighter than oil. He takes mishemen as than oil, rather than mishemen meaning from oil. You follow what I just said? Right? Does lehatzil panim mishemen mean that the oil makes the face shine, or that the face is so shiny, it is shinier even than oil? Well, here's the thing. sorry for going to obscure land, but in the Ugaritic epic Kirta, drought is described as the absence of these three things: bread, wine, and oil. I think that makes Alter's interpretation much less likely, because I think the point is to focus on these three things: wine, oil, and bread, and what they make possible. In other words, the random comparison, shinier than oil, misses the point that these three things are sources, not objects of comparison. Nod your head if what I just said makes sense and you were able to follow it. Yes, more or less. Andrew Hoffman, did you follow that? I happen to see you on my screen. Thank you. I just don't want to lose people on that one. Okay. So I suspect Alter here, missing the ancient Near Eastern context, is mistaken in his rendering. Verses 16 to 18, the trees, actually, let's read them first. Yisba'u atzei Hashem, the trees of God drink their fill. Arzei Lebanon asher nata, the cedars of Lebanon which God planted. Asher sham tziporim yikanenu, where birds make their nests. Chasida geroshim beita, the stork makes its home in the junipers. Okay? Harim hagvoim li'elim, the high mountains are for wild goats. Sla'im makseh lishfanim, the crags, the rocks are a refuge for rock badgers. Now, here, I want to suggest that we really need to read super carefully. In the Jewish Study Bible, Mark Brettler and Adele Berlin make the following comment about this. Mark Brettler and Adele Berlin are both very fine biblical scholars. Finer biblical scholars, well, they're actually biblical scholars, which I'm not. But I want to suggest that they say something here that is somewhere between inexact and incorrect, right? They say, here I'm going to quote, the trees, also nourished by the water God provides, were created for birds to live in. Mountains and caves were made to be homes for wild animals. End quote. I don't think the text says that. There is no so that between verses 16 and 17. That is, the meaning here, I think, is the trees are nourished and they serve as places for birds to live in, not so that they serve as places for birds to live in. In other words, the trees are not instrumentally valuable to God because they serve the birds. The trees are valuable and they have an instrumental for purpose as well. I think that this is actually an important distinction, because one of the things that I think this psalm is really committed to is the view that everything God creates is valuable in and of itself. It is not merely valuable for something else. So I'm going to suggest here with humility that Brettler and Berlin here kind of like are reading on a kind of impulse to say, oh, this is made for that. I don't see that at all. Okay, I hope that that's clear. Again, notice, please, right, that God satisfies not just people, but trees. And that the trees being sated, they in turn provide sustenance and hospitality for birds. I also have to say, at some point when I have, more time to dig into the psalm even further, I want to understand the meaning of the phrase Atzei Hashem, the trees of God. A phrase in this psalm not used of people, right? It's kind of a fascinating phrase, and I'm not sure I know what work it's doing. And then we hear that the creation of the celestial bodies sets the day and night cycle going. And what we're going to hear in a very radical and I think moving way is that each creature has its place in the cycle, the predators hunting by night, and the humans doing their work by day. Verse 19, Asay yareach lamoadim, God made the moon to mark, lamoadim, to mark the seasons. Shemesh yadam mivo'o, which JPS translates as the sun knows when to set. You can hear an allusion here, perhaps to Genesis 1:16, about the way God establishes the sun for the day and the moon for the night. Now, I also should just mention here, Asa Yareach is a dramatic repudiation of any notion that the heavenly bodies are themselves deities. They simply serve a function that God has created them for. Shemesh Yadam Mivo'o, which I just said, JPS says the sun knows when to set. Some scholars, based on one version of the Septuagint, read here not Shemesh Yadam Mivo'o, but Shemesh Yidam Mivo'o. That is, the sun, God appointed its setting. That actually fits well, but, you know, again, depending on how happy you are to hear, you're not even amending anything, you're just changing the vocalization, which is minimalist. You decide whether it's necessary. I want to just turn now to verse 21, because I think it's really quite important. Verses 21 to 23 as a unit, okay? Hakfirim shoagim lateref, the lions roar for prey, ulevakesh me'el ochlam, and to seek their food from God, okay? Tizrach hashemesh yasefun, the sun rises, they go home. Ve'elma onotam yirbetsun, and they couch in their dens. One of the things that you know only when you have very little children is that lions rest for 20 hours a day. You know this because if you have a 4-year-old boy, talking about lions, tigers, and cheetahs is kind of what you do all the time. And then in verse 23, Yetze Adam lefa'olo, the human being then goes out to his work, v'la avodato ade aref, and his labor until the evening. Please notice here how dramatic this is. There appears to be no difference here between, in these verses, the lion and the human. The only difference is that the lion takes the night shift and the human takes the day shift, but both are dependent on God for their sustenance. Now, I do want to note, and that's a pretty dramatic, I would say, a demotion of the human from a kind of anthropocentric illusion. Now, but I do want to mention here that it's interesting that as this psalm imagines it, an ecologically harmonious world includes one animal eating another, right? There is no sense here that an ecologically harmonious world is devoid of predation. You can look, of course, in the contrast between Isaiah chapter 11, where we hear about the lion and the, well, it's actually not the lion and the lamb in those verses. What is it? The lion and the, there's nowhere in the Bible that talks about a lion and a lamb. It's a lion and a, what is it? Namer imgdi, a tiger and a goat or whatever it is. Lions are not lying down with lambs here. There's a kind of acceptance of the way the world is, with God as the kind of superintendent providing lions with other creatures to eat. John Goldingay, Bible scholar, in his commentary describes God in these verses as the keeper of a wildlife park, right? God, it's not that the fundamental reality of nature has changed. And by the way, in the history of Jewish exegesis, the question of whether Isaiah 11 should be taken literally is also a vexed question, right? Is that just a way of saying the lion will lie down with the lamb, a way of saying that humans will no longer treat each other that way? Or is it imagining a transformation of nature itself? Okay, now, verse 24, okay. Ma rabu ma'asecha Adonai kulam b'chokhma asita male'ah ha'aretz kinyanecha. Familiar to many from davening. JPS and NIV translate as how many are your marabu, how many are your creations, God? I must say I don't think that is exact. I think that is inexact. The NRSV and others much more sensitively, how manifold are your creations, God? The difference between many and manifold is that manifold captures the variety which I think is very, very important here. It's not like how many, oh God, you made 76 trillion cheetahs. It's look at the sheer range and diversity of what you've made. And now we have this kind of exclamation, this summary of what we saw in verses 1 to 23. Also, it's worth noting here that the multiplicity of creation is interpreted here, understood as an expression of God's wisdom. And I wonder whether the ecological picture painted here, where everything has its place, it's not just that God created lots and lots of things, but that they live harmoniously with one another, is testimony to God's great and almost, unsurpassable wisdom. Okay, now, so we then have in verse 25, there is the sea vast and wide with its creatures beyond numbers. And then the first kind of human-made thing in verse 26, Sham oniyot yahalechun, there go the ships. And then this unbelievable phrase, Livyatan ze yatzarta l'sachek bo. Now the Leviathan, if you turn later on tonight to Psalm 74, for example, you'll see that the Leviathan, this has refractions in rabbinic literature as well, is the great threatening sea monster. Here, arguably, it is, as I mentioned a few sessions ago, a toy. The sea monster has been reduced to a kind of rubber ducky for God to play with in the water, right? So, the author of Psalm 74 would be just kind of like staggered by hearing Livyatan yatzarta l'sachek bo, this little toy you made to play with. Now, I should be honest and say it is possible to read the Hebrew here differently. Livyatan ze yatzarta l'sachek bo could be taken to mean the Leviathan which you created to play in the water. L'sachek bo would mean that the Leviathan is the one playing and bo is the water. That's not impossible. I think it is more common to take this as Leviathan is himself the water toy. L'sachek bo meaning for God to play with this. But the main point here, in either case, is that the Leviathan has been rendered utterly harmless. Nothing in the world itself is threatening God's purposes and designs for it. The order of creation is fundamentally not under threat. And one of the things that I've wondered is whether one of the ways the verse makes that point is by imagining that there are human ships in the same water as the Leviathan. As a rule, you don't want to take a cruise next to a sea monster. If you can take a cruise next to it, it's probably no longer a sea monster. It's either a tamed animal or maybe it's even just a little toy. Okay? And then I want to just sort of see the beauty here. Kulam elecha yisaberun latet ochlam beito. Now the all here is no longer, as in Psalm 145, the human, but is the all of verse 24. Kulam b'chokhmah asita. Every last created thing looks towards you to give them their food when it's due. An amazing testimony to God's providential management, providential care, really, of the world. Titain lahem, you give it to them, yilkotun, they gather it up. Tiftach yadecha yisbeun tov. You open your hand and they are all well satisfied. Now, please just think about this image. The image is of God feeding all of the animals by hand. Here, little lion. Here, little tiger. Here, little bison. Right? And God feeds each one of them out of God's own hand. The tremendous kind of concern of the tremendous concern for the well-being of every last created thing. Verse 29, Tastir panecha, right? If you hide your face, yibahelun, they will be, I can't actually see in the dark. Yibahalun, is it yibahelun? I can't actually even see. You hide your face and they will be terrified. And if you take away their breath, they perish. Here, I'm not sure about this, but this may be kind of talking to Genesis 2, in which God forms the human being out of dust and breathes life breath into the human. Here, God's breath is breathed into all living things. Without it, they die. Okay? Okay. Let's see, where should I? In verse 29, just want to mention, Tosef Rucham Yigvaun, if you take away their breath, they perish. The Septuagint here has Tosef Ruchacha Yigvaun, if you take away your breath. The idea, I think, is the same. Okay. If you look at verse 31, you see a kind of transition here. Yehi chavod Adonai leolam, yismach Adonai b'ma'asav. May the glory of God endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in God's works. Now, I think what is really gorgeous here is that usually, as we saw 2 weeks ago in Psalm 148, it is the creation that rejoices in or before God. Here, the reverse is the case, in which the prayer is that God will rejoice in God's creation. This is a kind of magnificent flip on the usual biblical image. And then I'm going to just, we have this commitment to kind of praise God. Ashira l'Adonai b'chayai, azamra lelohai be'odi. I will sing to God as long as I'm alive. I will chant, or I will hymn to God as long as I am still here. Ye'erav alav sichi. May my prayer please God. Here, yet another image, as we've seen in some other Psalms, the poem functions like a sacrifice, a praise that it may be found pleasing before God. Ye'erav sichi, like ve'arval Adonai minchat Yerushalayim, right? It is, I think, quite striking here that the prayer, this is like what we saw in Psalm 19, Yula ratzonim refi vehegyon libi, right? Where the words become a sacrifice. Whoever is unmuted, try to mute, please. Try to look and see if you're unmuted so that you'll unmute yourself, mute yourself. Thank you. Now, notice also what's beautiful here. In verse 31, God is imagined as rejoicing, and that presumably makes possible or energizes the psalmist's own rejoicing. Anochi esmach b'Adonai. You rejoice in creation, and I in turn will rejoice in you. Okay? I think that's like a really kind of beautiful and powerful. Now, I don't have time to spend a lot of time on the sort of seemingly, at first glance, discordant last verse. Yitamu chata'im min haaretz u'reshaim od einam. May sinners disappear from the earth, and the wicked exist no longer. So one of the questions that's worth kind of reflecting on is how the first 24 verses lead into the 25th. Okay, now, predictably, you can find source critics who say, well, verse 25 is not part of this poem because it's a totally different thought. It's some pious editor who felt the need to put in something like conventionally frum at the end of this poem. I'm always skeptical, or if you prefer to say it in a more scholarly way, even if there were an editor who did that, he's presumably not an idiot, and something animates him to think that verse 25 fits as a conclusion to verses 1 to 24. So what is that? So, one possibility, by the way, Robert Alter is a good example here of someone who just basically says, there's nothing in the rest of the poem that's like this. This is what he calls an editorially edited gesture of piety. I think that is a weak way to read text, especially for a literary reader, in my view. Brettler and Berlin say in an interesting way, in a very kind of like terse way, since their commentary is very, very brief, that the idea is, if creation is to truly be harmonious, the existence of sinners is the one thing that threatens the full harmony of the whole created order, right? Or Clinton McCann in his commentary on this psalm writes, the psalmist wants no one to interfere with the operation of the world as God intends it. He's just painted 24 verses of the world working just like God wants, right? Oh, and then he looks around and he sees that there are sinners. Okay. So that I think is one possibility of what's going on here. By the way, something that you could add here that I think is interesting from a theological and almost a spiritual perspective is that the move of this psalm is to suggest that it is human beings rather than sea monsters who are the real chaotic threat to God's creation now. Now that the sea monsters have been defeated, it's you and me who are the threats. This is like an ecological sermon, long before anyone had any imagination of how urgently needed those sermons would become, right? It's not the Leviathan who's a problem. He's a bath toy. It's Robert Zimring. He's the problem. He is the reason why the universe is not perfect. Okay? Now, there's different ways that you could kind of render this. You could fill this out and hear a certain kind of piety. One is to say, well, if all of this psalm is so much about dependence, then maybe the claim is that the sinners are the ones who won't acknowledge their dependence, and that allows them to think that the world is theirs to do with as they will. I don't think that those readings are all that far-fetched. I mean, I think you have to take a step, but I'm not sure if it takes so many steps to get there. I'll read to you, for those who are interested in biblical scholarship. This is Walter Brueggemann sounding like only Walter Brueggemann can in his classic Theology of the Old Testament. The sinners here are, quote, those who refuse to receive life in creation on terms of generous extravagance, no doubt in order to practice a hoarding autonomy in denial that creation is indeed governed and held by its creator. Creation has within it the sovereign seriousness of God, who will not tolerate the violation of the terms of creation, which are terms of gift, dependence, and extravagance. There's so much I could say about Brueggemann's way of reading. I want to mention just one other thing and then quickly look at some of your questions that you may have posted. A Bible scholar named William Brown makes the comment here that I found this, I have to say, in my own reading of the psalm very helpful. He says that without the last verse, it would be all too tempting to dismiss the psalm as a romantic, rose-colored, almost Pollyannish view of the world. And acknowledging that there are sinners and sin is a way of taking the sugarcoating off the picture. It kind of gives a reality check to juxtapose to the glorious picture of creation that's here. I think that's really interesting. And I'm not sure it's the only intention here, but I think it's actually an interesting one to think about. Sorry, you know what? I guess I should say one other last thing that is important here. I mean, there's so many things we could say that are important, but here, in contrast to what I've said a couple of times in the last couple of weeks about the integration of the God of creation with the God of history, here, the psalmist is not really interested in the God of history or salvation, right? The nearness of God is experienced in one's creaturely dependence, not in God saving Israel from its enemies or, redeeming these great redemptive acts in history, right? It is the psalmist experiences the sort of kindness and sustaining care of God simply in the fact that he has food to eat and that there's grain. It's a much more creational spirituality. Now, again, it is deeply non-pantheistic, right? It is creation as totally dependent on its transcendent creator. But it has a kind of deep unity in that all of creation is together in this kind of fellowship of creatureliness. Okay. All right, I guess I should stop there. I gave you in some length a passage from Clinton McCann where he tries to read what he thinks a theological let's call it a theological environmentalism would look like, and how a text like this would sustain and drive that. I didn't want to necessarily endorse everything he says, but I thought it would be fruitful for people to read and think about this. And I thought some of you might enjoy and find it provocative. Now, I have very little time, but let me see. Oh, and see, if I don't say write Q, people don't write Q. Ileana, if you could save the chat box for me at the end, that would be great. Hold on. Judith Cates writes, you are confirming my sense that this Psalm is a powerful counter to feminist goddess theologians like Carol Christ, who criticize the dominion model as characteristic of the Hebrew Bible. Yeah, for sure. First of all, I mean, for what it's worth, and I've said this before, I think that the dominion model is not what the caricature of the dominion model is, right? In other words, even the dominion model is far more nuanced than the quote-unquote dominion model, but also there are other models that live alongside it. The Bible has a multiplicity of theological models of the relationship of God to creation. Now, if you think there was a moment when some feminist theologians kind of tried to argue that any notion of transcendence is inherently patriarchal and problematic. That is an idea I have to say I've not only never been able to accept, I've never really been able to understand it. That's, I think, in my view, for whatever it's worth, the weakest link in Judith Plaskow's Standing Again at Sinai, which is a really important book in many ways. I just don't really understand that. But here, the notion that God is transcendent is inextricably bound up with God as nurturer. And in some ways, it's God's very transcendence that enables God to be a sustainer. If you're on the same level as everyone, you're dependent just like they are. What makes you able to be the nurturing mother, if you will, is precisely your transcendence, which is why I don't think people should suggest that transcendence somehow is an offense against feminism. In some ways, I think it's actually quite necessary, but that would be a topic for a seminar on 20th century Jewish thought. Okay, hold on. Sherry writes, herbage that man may get food out of the earth, motzi lechem min haaretz, is from here. Yes. And that reminds me, I almost cannot hear the bracha, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, anymore without thinking about the wonderful image that the late Yaakov Pedachovsky made known. Yaakov Pedachovsky wrote several essays, and in which he basically argued, if you ask me if I believe in Torah min hashamayim, I believe in it in exactly the same way as I believe in lechem min haaretz. That is worth putting in your pipe and smoking for a few days, right? I believe that Torah comes from heaven exactly the way bread comes from the earth. Sorry, I'm just going to take a minute to delight in Pedachovsky's image there. In verse 16, I need to go back here. You want to hear Asherot here? Why? I would say the opposite, right? They're not gods. They're thoroughly created. Oh, you think that the tree of God would be God's Asherah? Interesting. Haven't seen that. I'm very skeptical, but I will do some digging around. That's a really interesting comment, you heretic, you. Verse 17. Junipers are broshim. You are looking at Paul or whoever, if it was Paul or Leah, you were looking at verse 16. Let's just see. Hillary, it seems to me to be a midrashic leap, like that Litzachek is like Isaac and Yishmael. Yeah, I think that's a leap. It's a clever leap, but now this is an important question, and I am out of time, but Philip writes here, doesn't verse 26, if we take it to refer to Leviathan as rubber ducky, support Alter's domestication of the mythology view? So I don't think so, but I think because the progression of this psalm appears to include the mythological battle within it. And it's after the mythological battle that God reduces the sea monster to being a mere toy. It is not that the sea monster is a mere toy. This is not like Genesis 1, I don't think, where the text just says, oh, and God made the Taninim. I think that this is more subtle than that. Now, just a little context here, so it doesn't just seem that I'm like beating up on Robert Alter. The idea is here that there was a time in which it was very common among biblical scholars to say that the Bible is much more robustly monotheistic than any text around it, and it does not really have mythology, and to the extent that it does, it is kind of vestigial language. It is that idea that Alter kind of like goes to every time you see mythological imagery. That is, I think quite literally, he's probably depending on having studied Yechezkel Kaufman's Toldot HaEmunah, what's it called? Toldot HaEmunah Yisraeli, Toldot HaEmunah Yisrael, whatever, I forget exactly what it's called. This very, very long, but classic work of Jewish biblical theology. As I've said many times, it seems to me the Bible does have an array of mythological images. And if you're uncomfortable with the mythology, I think it's important at least to be open to the experience that the mythology is trying to convey, which is, what do you mean that the world was made from nothing? Or what do you mean that the world has been totally rendered habitable for human and other life? The world is still chaotic. The notion of creation as a struggle, and not only a struggle, but an ongoing struggle, is really, I think, quite important. Psalm 104 is not about it being an ongoing struggle. It's about it as having been a completed struggle, right? God has won. And the result of that is this radically harmonious world. Now, Andrew Hoffman wrote, verse 31 seemed like an add-on. So possibly, but again, I think 31 to 34 are the moment when the psalm turns to direct prayer rather than mere, is that what I mean? I don't know if I mean mere, but rather than just kind of describing in a kind of, glorious way, it invites God into the delight. I should stop. There's some more questions here. Okay, most of these are very nice. Thank you, letters. Thank you. Okay, no more questions. Okay, thank you all very, very much. Again, I hope you'll have further opportunities to study with me, to study with Hadar, to study on jewishlive.org, and most importantly, really wishing you all health, safety to you and all your loved ones, healing for all of those in need, strength and fortitude for those caring for the sick, and hopes for this country's physical and mental health. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shai.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shai. This was
you.
great.
Thank you.
Do well.
תודה רבה.
Thank you, Shai. Very good, wonderful.
Thank you.
להתראות.
Somebody disappointed.
Did we do anything that was on your 25 list?
Everyone wants to see that list. It's amazing.